A former casino slot floor manager just revealed something that's going to fundamentally change how you think about those players' club cards. Her name is Jennifer, and she spent 12 years working at three different major casinos in Nevada. She walked away from a six-figure salary last year because, in her words, she couldn't stomach what she was watching anymore. According to Jennifer and four other former employees who've come forward in the past 6 months, casinos have been using technology that specifically identifies regular players and creates what they call personalized experiences. These aren't random games of chance anymore. These are systems designed to recognize you, track your behavior, and adjust in ways that keep you playing longer than you ever intended. What these former employees are describing has cost documented players tens of thousands of dollars, and the industry has fought hard to keep this information internal. Today, you're hearing directly from the people who program these systems, maintain these machines, and watch these tactics work day after day. Pattern number one: player profile tracking. The first thing these former employees want you to know involves that player's club card you swipe before you start playing. Most people think it's just tracking points for free play and comps. According to former slot technicians, it's doing something far more sophisticated. The card is feeding information directly to the machine about who you are as a player, your win-loss history over months or even years, your average bet size, how long your typical sessions last, how often you visit, whether you tend to cash out when you're ahead or keep playing. All of this data gets compiled into what former employees call your player profile, and that profile follows you to every machine you play. Jennifer tells the story of a woman named Margaret who became a regular at her casino over an 18-month period. Margaret came in every Thursday afternoon and played video poker, almost always on the same bank of machines near the high-limit room. Jennifer was initially assigned as Margaret's casino host, which meant she had access to Margaret's complete player profile in the system. The profile showed everything. Margaret's lifetime theoretical loss was just over $42,000. Her average session length was 2 hours and 17 minutes. She typically bet max credits at the dollar denomination. And here's what Jennifer found disturbing. The profile included notes from previous hosts about Margaret's behavior patterns, including the specific times during a session when Margaret typically showed signs of wanting to leave. According to multiple former employees, machines that are connected to player tracking systems can receive basic information about player profiles. The machines don't get your name or specific financial details, but they do receive data about your player tier status and your general behavioral category. Former slot technicians report that certain manufacturers have built systems where machines can adjust what they call the game feel based on whether you're a regular player or a casual one. The frequency of near misses, those agonizing moments where the jackpot symbol lands just above or below the pay line, can be weighted differently. The spacing of small wins that keep you playing, those little 15 or 20 credit hits that feel like the machine is staying active, can be programmed with your loyalty tier in mind. This is where the trap mechanism becomes clear. Regular players, people who've established patterns over weeks or months, start getting what feels like a personalized experience. The machine seems to know when to give you a small win, right when you're thinking about leaving. It seems to understand your rhythm. Former employees describe it as fishing with personalized bait instead of just casting random lines. You're not playing against pure chance anymore. You're playing against a system that's been studying you. Jennifer describes the emotional impact of watching this happen to Margaret. After several months, Margaret told Jennifer she felt like her regular machines knew her, that they had a relationship with her. Jennifer knew exactly why Margaret felt that way, because she could see in the back-end system how Margaret's play patterns were being categorized and utilized. The technical term casinos use is player development, but former employees have started calling it something else: behavioral profiling for retention. Jennifer says it felt less like hospitality and more like systematic exploitation of loyalty. But if you think tracking your play history is manipulative, wait until you hear about what former floor managers revealed about machine positioning and the myths they actively encourage regular players to believe. And if tracking your play history seemed calculated, former floor managers are revealing something even more deliberate about the machines themselves and where they're positioned on the casino floor. This goes beyond simple surveillance. According to multiple former slot directors, casinos actively exploit myths about hot and cold machines, and they've designed the floor layout specifically to take advantage of regular players who think they've figured out the system. Pattern number two involves what former employees call streak perception programming. According to three former slot technicians who worked for major manufacturers, certain popular multi-denomination games like Buffalo Grand and Lightning Link are programmed with algorithms that create what players perceive as hot and cold cycles. These aren't actual cycles in any mathematically meaningful sense, because every spin is still randomly generated within the programmed parameters. But the distribution of small wins, bonus triggers, and near misses gets weighted in ways that create the psychological perception of momentum or drought. A former technical specialist named Marcus spent 7 years working on slot floor analytics for a major strip casino. He describes a regular player named James who kept meticulous records for 6 months, convinced he'd identified a pattern in when certain machines paid out. James tracked the time of day, how long since the last jackpot hit, how many players had cycled through a particular machine, and dozens of other variables. Marcus says James had spreadsheets with thousands of data points. James genuinely believed he'd discovered something, and he structured his entire playing schedule around his perceived patterns. Marcus had access to the actual machine performance data, and he could see that James's patterns were completely illusory. The machine was performing exactly as programmed, with random outcomes weighted to create that feeling of pattern without any actual predictive value. What disturbed Marcus most was watching management's response to players like James. According to Marcus, floor managers were specifically trained not to correct these beliefs. Internal training materials that Marcus says he reviewed during his employment included sections on managing players who believe in hot and cold machines. The guidance wasn't to educate these players about randomness. It was to acknowledge their beliefs in neutral ways that didn't discourage the behavior. Marcus recalls a specific training scenario where supervisors were taught to respond to questions about machine patterns with phrases like, "every machine is different," or "you never know when it might hit," rather than explaining that each spin is an independent random event. Now, you might be thinking you can avoid this psychological trap by moving around and switching machines frequently, but that assumption leads directly to pattern number three, and this one reveals just how deliberately casino floors are designed to exploit regular player behavior. Pattern number three, bank positioning strategy. Former slot floor managers describe something they call bank positioning strategy. According to a former director of slot operations named Patricia, who spent 19 years in casino management, every bank of machines is carefully designed with what she calls show machines and hold machines. The show machines are typically positioned at the end of banks or in high visibility locations, where their activity can be seen from multiple angles. These machines often run with slightly higher RTP configurations or more frequent bonus triggers. They're the machines that create visible wins, the ones that make noise and draw attention with their celebration sequences. The hold machines are positioned in what Patricia calls comfort zones. These are the interior positions in the banks, the machines that regular players migrate toward because they feel more private and less exposed. According to Patricia, these positions frequently house lower RTP, configurations of the same game model. A regular player sitting at a hold machine might be playing the identical game title as someone at a show machine 3 seats away, but with meaningfully different mathematical profiles. Patricia describes a regular player named Tom who came in 4 or 5 times a week for more than 3 years. Tom had his preferred machine in the middle of a bank of Lightning Link games near the sportsbook. He'd sit in that same seat for hours, and Patricia says he could watch other players at the end of the bank hit bonuses and major progressives while his machine seemed to stay cold. Tom attributed this to luck or timing. Patricia knew it was positioning. The machine Tom preferred was configured as a hold machine with tighter programming than the show machine he could see from his seat. The psychological manipulation here targets something specific about regular players that doesn't affect casual visitors. Regular players develop territorial attachment to specific machines or specific seats. They build superstitions about their lucky spot. They feel comfortable in familiar positions. Patricia says floor managers understand this behavior intimately and design banks to exploit it. The flashy wins happen where everyone can see them. The grinding losses happen in the comfortable middle seats where regulars settle in for long sessions. Former employees report that this bank design strategy is standard across the industry, and multiple slot directors have confirmed that regular players almost never realize they're deliberately choosing the positions that are mathematically least favorable. Tom played in that same seat for 3 years, feeding a hold machine while watching show machines pay out around him, never understanding that his choice of position was costing him thousands of dollars in theoretical return. But here's where these revelations become truly disturbing, because the tactics I'm about to describe go beyond positioning and programming into something former employees describe as psychological warfare against your decision making ability. Before I reveal pattern number 4, and this one is absolutely insidious according to the former employees who've come forward, I need to ask you something important. Casino management has actively worked to prevent this information from reaching regular players. Multiple former employees have described pressure from their employers to sign non-disparagement agreements, and at least 2 were threatened with legal action for speaking publicly about these systems. By subscribing to this channel, you're helping ensure this information gets distributed to the people who need it most. The algorithms that run these machines are sophisticated, but the algorithm that determines whether this video reaches other regular players is something we can actually influence together. And let me know in the comments, have you ever felt like a machine recognized you when you sat down? Like it knew your playing style or your patterns? Because what I'm about to share explains why that feeling might not be in your head at all. Pattern number 4, session length algorithms. And this revelation comes primarily from technical specialists who work directly with manufacturers like Konami and Aristocrat. According to a former senior technician named David, who spent 11 years servicing and programming machines across multiple casino properties, certain manufacturers have built systems that track continuous play duration through the player's club card insertion and betting pattern analysis. The machines aren't just recording that you're playing. They're monitoring how long you've been playing in a single session without cashing out or taking a break. David describes the technical architecture as fairly straightforward from a programming perspective, but devastatingly effective from a behavioral psychology standpoint. The system monitors your session clock and cross-references it against your player profile data about typical session lengths. If you're a regular player whose profile shows you normally play for about 90 minutes before leaving, the system recognizes when you're approaching that 90-minute threshold. According to David and 2 other former technicians who've corroborated this account, bonus features and higher value base game wins show increased trigger frequencies at these psychological quit points. The specific intervals that former employees mention most frequently are 30 minutes, 90 minutes, and 2.5 hours. These timeframes apparently correspond to natural attention span limits and session fatigue points that casino analytics teams have identified through years of player tracking data. David explains that the system doesn't guarantee a bonus at these intervals, but the probability weighting shifts just enough to make it statistically more likely that you'll hit something meaningful right when your brain is telling you it's time to leave. The trap here specifically targets regular players because casual visitors don't establish the predictable session rhythms that the system needs to function effectively. Someone who comes to a casino once or twice a year and plays for 45 minutes doesn't generate enough historical data for the algorithm to identify their quit point patterns. But a regular who comes in every week and consistently plays for roughly the same duration creates a behavioral signature that the system can recognize and exploit. David recalls analyzing bonus trigger data for a bank of Konami machines over a 3-month period and noticing statistical clusters around these specific time intervals, but only for players whose cards showed regular play patterns. The correlation was strong enough that David brought it to his supervisor's attention, assuming it was some kind of programming error or unintended bug in the system. His supervisor told him the clustering was working as designed. That conversation was part of what eventually led David to leave the industry. The cruelty of this mechanism becomes obvious when you look at the actual mathematics of slot play. David explains that if you're playing a machine with a 92% RTP, which is fairly standard for denominations of $1 or higher, You're losing $8 for every $100 you cycle through the machine on average. A regular player betting $3 per spin at a moderate pace of 8 spins per minute is cycling through about $1,400 per hour. At an 8% house edge, that's a theoretical loss of roughly $112 per hour. If you're 90 minutes into a session, you've theoretically lost about $168. Then, right as you're thinking about leaving, you hit a bonus that pays $120. It feels like a win. Your brain gets that dopamine reward from the lights and sounds and the credit meter climbing, but you're still down $48 for the session, and now instead of leaving, you keep playing. Because the machine feels hot. Jennifer, the former floor manager from earlier, describes watching this psychological trap work on regular players dozens of times per shift. A player would stand up, collect their ticket, start to walk away from the machine, then sit back down for just a few more spins after hitting a modest bonus. Those few more spins would turn into another hour, and the $48 deficit would become a $300 loss. Jennifer says floor supervisors would sometimes watch these moments on surveillance cameras and make unofficial bets on whether the player would actually leave or sit back down. The bonus timing made it predictable enough that supervisors could guess with fairly high accuracy. Pattern number 5. Progressive investment fallacy. And speaking of bonuses that create psychological lock-in effects, it involves a specific type of machine that former employees say they watch destroy not just bankrolls but relationships and financial stability. Multiple former slot attendants and floor managers have described progressive jackpot systems, particularly wide area progressives like Wheel of Fortune and Megabucks, as deliberate investment fallacy traps designed specifically to exploit regular players. A former slot attendant named Christine worked at a regional casino for 8 years, and she describes a regular player named Rachel whose story haunted Christine enough that she brought it up repeatedly in exit interview discussions when she left the industry. Rachel became fixated on a Wheel of Fortune machine that she'd been playing regularly for about 7 months. During that time, Rachel had put what Christine estimates was somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 through that specific machine, chasing the major progressive jackpot that had climbed to just over $2 million. Rachel told Christine multiple times that she'd invested too much into that machine to walk away now, that she'd fed it for months and someone else would hit her jackpot if she stopped playing. Christine explains that Rachel's logic made no mathematical sense whatsoever. Every spin on a progressive machine has the exact same probability of hitting the jackpot regardless of how much money you've previously put into it. The machine has no memory of Rachel's play history in any meaningful sense. Her 7 months of previous play gave her no advantage, no increased probability, no priority claim on the progressive. But Rachel's player profile and her regular status made her psychologically vulnerable to the investment fallacy in ways that casual players simply aren't. The targeting becomes clear when you understand how casinos position these wide-area, progressive machines. According to 2 former slot directors, these games are deliberately placed in high-traffic areas that regular players pass through multiple times per visit. They're positioned near entrances, along main walkways, adjacent to popular restaurant locations. The progressive meters are large and visible, often with eye-level digital displays that show the constantly climbing jackpot amount. Regular players see these meters dozens of times during every casino visit, and former employees report that this repeated exposure creates what marketing psychologists call the mere exposure effect. The more you see something, the more familiar it becomes, and familiarity breeds a false sense of connection or ownership. Christine describes the endpoint of Rachel's story with obvious discomfort even years after the fact. Rachel eventually spent her entire savings account, roughly $28,000, chasing that Wheel of Fortune progressive. She never hit it. Another player hit the major jackpot about 2 weeks after Rachel finally stopped coming to the casino. Christine says she felt physically ill when she saw the jackpot hit notification, knowing Rachel would probably hear about it and feel devastated. Multiple former employees mentioned similar stories about regular players who developed parasocial relationships with specific progressive machines, convincing themselves that their continued play was an investment rather than a series of independent negative expectation bets. We're getting to the final 2 patterns now, And these are the ones that former employees consistently describe as the practices that made them question whether they could continue working in the industry. What's coming next involves manipulation tactics that several former staff members characterized as deliberately targeting the psychological vulnerabilities that regular play creates. Pattern number 6: wins disguised as losses involves something that former game developers say was specifically engineered to exploit a psychological vulnerability that only emerges after thousands of spins, which means it almost exclusively affects regular players. This revelation comes from former programmers who worked on what the industry calls real power and extra real power systems, primarily manufactured by IGT and Aristocrat. According to these developers, these multi-line games were deliberately designed to deliver wins that are actually losses, complete with celebration sounds, flashing graphics, and animated sequences that trigger the same dopamine response as genuine winning spins. A former game mathematician named Robert worked in slot development for 9 years before leaving the industry in 2021. He describes the design philosophy behind these systems with obvious discomfort. The games typically feature 243 ways to win or even 3001, 125 ways to win, which sounds incredibly player-friendly until you understand what actually constitutes a win in these systems. According to Robert, a standard configuration might require a 60 credit bet to activate all the pay lines and bonus features. The game then delivers frequent small symbol combinations that pay 8 credits, 12 credits, or 20 credits. The machine celebrates these outcomes with the exact same audio and visual fanfare it uses for legitimate winning spins. Players hear the distinctive chime, watch the winning combination animate across the screen, see their credit meter tick upward, and experience what feels like a win. But they just lost 48 credits on a spin that paid 12. The accumulation trap becomes devastating over extended play periods. Robert explains that focus group testing during game development showed that regular players, people who'd been playing these multi-line games for several months, stopped accurately tracking their net win-loss position after approximately 200 spins. Their brains became so conditioned to the celebration response that they began categorizing these losing spins as wins in their mental accounting. A player might finish a 4-hour session genuinely believing they'd hit dozens of winning spins, when the reality was they'd been losing money on 70% of the outcomes the machine was celebrating. Internal reports that Robert says he reviewed during his employment showed that regular players demonstrated roughly 60% less accurate perception of their net win-loss compared to casual players on these specific game types. The desensitization effect required extended exposure, which meant it didn't significantly impact weekend visitors or tourists, but it was devastatingly effective against regulars who played the same games multiple times per week. Casino analytics teams apparently understood this differential impact clearly because Robert recalls seeing internal communications that specifically discussed these games as tools for regular player retention rather than new player acquisition. The most disturbing aspect of Robert's testimony involves the deliberate nature of the design. This wasn't an accidental byproduct of multi-line game mathematics. According to Robert, development teams conducted extensive psychological testing to optimize the celebration response threshold, determining exactly how small a win could be while still triggering the positive emotional reaction they wanted. They tested different sound effects, different animation speeds, different visual effects, all calibrated to make 12 credit returns on 60 credit bets feel like meaningful wins. Robert describes one particular development meeting where team members discussed whether to include a damping feature that would scale down the celebration intensity for wins that were less than the bet amount. That feature was rejected specifically because, according to Robert's recollection of the discussion, reducing celebration for small wins would make the net loss nature of these outcomes too transparent. Jennifer, the floor manager whose testimony opened this investigation, corroborates the effectiveness of these win disguised as loss systems from the operational side. She describes regular players on games like Buffalo Gold and Lightning Link, both of which use variations of this multi-line celebration system, who would play for 6 or 7 hours and genuinely believe they'd had a good session because they'd hit so many bonuses and winning spins. Jennifer could pull up their actual play tracking data and see they'd lost $800 or $1,200, but the players would cash out, talking about how well the machine had treated them. The conditioning was so complete that their subjective experience and the mathematical reality had completely separated. Pattern number 7, tier anxiety system. This represents what multiple former employees describe as the practice that finally made them question whether they could participate in the industry any longer. This final pattern involves the comp system itself, and according to former casino hosts and marketing directors, it was deliberately designed to create panic-driven play during specific time windows, targeting the exact psychological vulnerabilities that regular play creates. A former marketing director named Sandra worked at 2 different major casino properties over 14 years, and she describes the tier-based comp system as the most calculated exploitation of regular players she encountered in her entire career. The system works by offering escalating benefits at different tier levels, typically something like gold, platinum, diamond, and 7 stars, or their equivalents at different casino brands. Regular players work their way up these tiers through consistent play, and each tier offers incrementally better benefits like room discounts, free play credits, priority check-in, dedicated hosts, and invitations to special events. According to Sandra, the system tracks your tier qualifying play on a rolling 12-month basis, which means your status is constantly at risk of downgrade if your play frequency or volume decreases. And here's where the trap activates. The player tracking system automatically identifies accounts that are approaching tier expiration, and it begins sending targeted communications and adjusting comp earning rates specifically designed to trigger what Sandra calls tier anxiety. Sandra describes the algorithm as ruthlessly effective. Between 2 and 4 weeks before a regular player's tier status is set to drop, assuming their current pace of play won't maintain their level, the system triggers a series of escalating interventions. First come the email reminders about how much tier credit you still need to maintain your status. Then the direct mail offers with bonus tier credit promotions. Then the phone calls from hosts mentioning your status situation and offering special limited time earning opportunities. According to Sandra, the comp earning rates themselves would often increase during these windows, sometimes doubled or tripled for specific time periods, creating artificial urgency and a now or never psychological pressure. The cruelty of this system becomes clear when you understand who it affects. Casual players don't track their tier status closely enough to feel anxiety about losing it. They might not even know what tier they are. But regular players, people who've been coming consistently for months or years, have built their casino experience around their tier benefits. They've gotten accustomed to the perks, the recognition, the status. Sandra describes watching regular players dramatically increase both their play frequency and their bet sizes during these tier anxiety windows, sometimes visiting the casino 3 or 4 times in a single week when they normally came once, sometimes betting $5 or $10 per spin when they normally bet 2. Sandra tells the story of a retiree named Dorothy, who had been a regular at Sandra's casino for 6 years, maintaining diamond status through consistent weekly play. Dorothy's fixed income from Social Security was roughly $1,800 per month, and Sandra knew from her player profile that Dorothy typically budgeted about $400 per month for casino play. During a tier anxiety window in late 2019, Dorothy came in 7 times over 12 days, desperate to maintain her status before the deadline. Sandra watched Dorothy's tracking data show she'd cycled through her entire monthly Social Security check, trying to earn the last few thousand tier credits she needed. When Sandra tried to gently suggest that Dorothy was playing more than usual, Dorothy became emotional and explained that she couldn't lose her diamond status because the recognition and perks were the highlight of her month, that being treated special by the staff made her feel valued in a way she didn't experience elsewhere in her life. Sandra says she was instructed by her supervisors that interventions in these situations should focus on helping players find ways to maintain their status, not on questioning whether maintaining status was worth the financial cost. Former marketing executives describe internal emails and strategy documents that specifically discussed tier anxiety as a revenue driver, with particular focus on regular players in the second highest tier who'd become accustomed to elevated status. but hadn't yet reached the top tier where the casino's profit margin on their play would decline. Multiple former hosts describe being given scripts and talking points designed to emphasize status benefits and downplay the cost of maintaining them. Now, everything I've just revealed involves systems and machines that are operating in casinos right now today. But former employees aren't just speaking out about current practices, they're sounding an alarm about technology that's already in development and starting to roll out in test markets. And according to multiple former developers and marketing executives, these next generation systems will make everything you've heard so far seem primitive by comparison. A former senior developer named Mitchell worked on AI driven personalization systems for one of the industry's largest manufacturers until early 2023, and his testimony about what's coming next is genuinely disturbing. These aren't theoretical future concepts. These are systems currently in beta testing at select properties, with wider deployment planned over the next 18 to 36 months. The foundation of this new technology involves real-time behavioral analysis that goes far beyond the player tracking systems currently in use. According to Mitchell, the AI systems his team was developing can analyze dozens of behavioral inputs simultaneously during active play. The technology monitors your bet hesitation patterns, measuring the microsecond delays between spins to identify when you're uncertain versus when you're playing confidently. It tracks your speed of play across hundreds of spins, recognizing when you're accelerating due to excitement or slowing down due to frustration or fatigue. It analyzes your cash out patterns, learning whether you tend to leave after hitting a certain win threshold or whether you typically play back your wins. Some systems in development are even designed to integrate with facial recognition technology to cross reference your behavioral data with visual indicators of emotional state. Mitchell describes the mood based algorithm component as the aspect of development that ultimately made him leave the industry. The system uses all of these behavioral inputs to categorize your current emotional state into what the development team called engagement zones. If the system detects that you're in what they classified as a frustrated or discouraged zone based on your play patterns slowing down, your bet sizing becoming erratic, or your session showing signs of ending, the machine's volatility profile can shift to deliver more frequent small wins and near misses. If the system categorizes you as being in an excited or confident zone, indicated by faster play speed and consistent bet sizing, the volatility can shift toward longer dry spells between wins. According to Mitchell, the goal is to smooth out the emotional peaks and valleys, keeping players in what internal documents called the sustainable engagement corridor for as long as possible. The truly disturbing element is that regular players are the primary data source for training these algorithms. Mitchell explains that the AI systems require months of historical data to build accurate behavioral models for individual players. Someone visiting a casino for the someone. First time generates data, but not enough for the system to personalize effectively. Regular players who've established patterns over dozens or hundreds of sessions create the rich data sets that make these algorithms function. Mitchell describes watching beta test results from a facility in Oklahoma where a player identified in documentation as Kevin had his playing patterns mapped across what the research team categorized as 40 distinct emotional states over 6 months of regular play. The system learned to recognize micro patterns in Kevin's behavior that predicted his emotional state and likely next actions with enough accuracy that the research team could forecast his session length and total loss within 15% margins before he'd even placed 20 bets. But the personalization goes deeper than just mood-based volatility adjustment. Former programmers describe work on what patent applications from major manufacturers call player-specific outcome presentation systems. This is personalized near-miss programming, and it represents a fundamental shift in how machines operate. Traditional slot machines generate outcomes randomly within their programmed parameters, and near misses happen as a natural mathematical consequence of how symbols are weighted on the reels. According to former developers, the new systems being tested can adjust near miss frequency based on how individual players have historically responded to near miss outcomes. If your play history shows that near misses tend to extend your session length, you'll see more of them. If your data suggests near misses frustrate you and accelerate your departure, the system reduces their frequency for you specifically. Two players sitting at adjacent machines playing the same game title could experience dramatically different near miss rates based on their individual psychological profiles. Mitchell references specific patent applications that are publicly available through the USPTO, filed by companies including AGS, Scientific Games, and Evereye, describing systems for dynamic outcome presentation based on player engagement metrics. The language in these patents is carefully constructed to stay within legal boundaries. But Mitchell says the internal development discussions were explicit about the purpose being to optimize revenue extraction from regular players by personalizing the psychological manipulation to each individual's specific vulnerabilities. The patents describe monitoring player interaction patterns and adjusting game presentation elements to maintain engagement, which Mitchell translates as identifying what keeps each person playing and giving them more of it. The third component of these next generation systems involves social integration, and former marketing executives describe this as potentially the most effective retention mechanism ever developed for regular players. The systems in development will connect to social media platforms and create leaderboards, achievement systems, and challenge frameworks that introduce peer pressure and social competition into what has traditionally been solitary gambling. A former marketing executive named Richard worked on social integration strategy for 18 months before leaving his position in late 2022. He describes focus group testing, where regular players were given access to features that let them share wins on social media, compare their progress against friends on achievement tracks, and participate in time-limited challenges with visible rankings. According to Richard, the impact on session length and total amount wagered was dramatically higher than any traditional promotion or comp offering the team had ever tested. Regular players who were shown that friends or other players were ahead of them on achievement tracks would extend sessions by an average of 43 minutes and increase their average bet size by roughly 30%. The competitive element transformed the experience from gambling into what Richard describes as gamified competition, where the goal stopped being winning money and became beating other players on arbitrary metrics. Richard recalls one test participant, a regular player who normally visited twice a week and played for about 90 minutes per session, who came in 5 times in 1 week and played for more than 4 hours per session because he was competing with two friends to reach a particular achievement level first. The participant lost significantly more money than in any previous week in his play history, but his post-session survey responses indicated he'd had more fun and felt more engaged than he typically did. Richard says the social integration features are designed to specifically target what he calls community regulars, players who've developed social connections with other regulars and with staff. The system will identify these players through analysis of their check-in patterns, their interaction with host services, and eventually through social media connections once integration is complete. These players will receive targeted notifications when their friends are at the casino, when they're falling behind on leaderboards, when limited time challenges are available. Richard describes this as transforming the casino from a place you go to gamble into a place you go to interact with your community. Except every interaction is mediated through systems designed to increase your wagering. Mitchell's final testimony about why he'd left the industry centers on a development meeting in late 2022 where the team was reviewing beta test results from multiple properties. The data showed that regular players exposed to the full suite of personalization features, the mood-based algorithms, the individualized near-miss programming, and the social integration elements, were showing significantly increased session lengths and total wagered amounts compared to control groups. Mitchell describes one product manager celebrating that the technology had successfully made gambling not feel like gambling anymore, that it felt like a sophisticated game players were trying to master against the house and against each other. Mitchell says that specific phrase, that gambling wouldn't feel like gambling, was his breaking point. He realized the entire development effort was aimed at disguising the nature of what was happening, making systematic losses feel like engaging entertainment. Several former employees identify these emerging technologies as the reason they've chosen to speak publicly despite legal risks and professional consequences. They describe watching an industry that's moving from exploiting general human psychological vulnerabilities to building systems that identify and exploit individual vulnerabilities with surgical precision. And all of these systems require one thing to function effectively: regular players with established patterns and rich historical data. The biggest trap isn't any single machine or system. It's becoming the regular player whose data trains the algorithms that will be used against you. The 7 patterns these former employees have revealed share one unmistakable commonality that becomes impossible to ignore when you see them laid out together: the loyalty card tracking system that builds your behavioral profile over months, the streak perception programming that exploits pattern-seeking behavior that only develops through repeated exposure, the bank positioning strategy that takes advantage of territorial attachment to specific seats, the session length algorithms that need historical data about your typical playing rhythms to function, the progressive investment fallacy that requires weeks or months of play to establish psychological ownership, the win disguised as loss conditioning that only works after thousands of spins have desensitized you to celebration responses, and the tier anxiety system that weaponizes the status you've accumulated through loyal regular play. Every single one of these traps specifically targets people who play often enough to establish patterns, people who visit frequently enough to generate the data these systems need to function. The biggest trap isn't any individual machine or any specific psychological technique. The biggest trap is becoming a regular player in the first place, because that's when everything changes. Former employees describe this transformation in remarkably consistent terms across different properties and different markets. Once you're in the system as a regular, once your player profile has enough data to categorize your behavioral patterns and predict your responses, the casino stops treating you like a random player enjoying entertainment gambling and starts treating you like a managed resource to optimize. Jennifer, the floor manager who opened these revelations, put it most directly during one of her final interviews before leaving the industry. She said the entire apparatus of player development, from the tracking systems to the comp structure to the floor layout to the machine programming itself, operates on a fundamental principle that regular players represent the real profit center, and everything else is just window dressing to maintain the perception of random chance and fair play. The mathematics behind this focus become clear when you understand the revenue distribution in modern casino operations. According to multiple former marketing executives, industry analytics consistently show that approximately 80% of slot revenue comes from roughly 20% of players. That 20% are the regulars, the people who visit weekly or multiple times per month, the people who've established patterns and built relationships with properties and staff. Jennifer describes attending quarterly revenue meetings, where executives would explicitly discuss strategies for regular player retention as the single most important operational priority, far outweighing new player acquisition or casual visitor entertainment. One former marketing director recalled a senior vice president stating in a strategy meeting that the casino didn't need to trap casual players at all, that casual players would come and go naturally, but the business model absolutely required trapping regular players and keeping them regular, keeping them loyal, keeping them generating data that made all of these personalized systems increasingly effective. Former employees describe specific markers that indicate when you've crossed the threshold from casual player to regular player in the casino's categorization system. If you're visiting more than twice per month consistently over a 3-month period, you're almost certainly classified as a regular in their tracking systems. If you're using your player's club card for more than 70% of your play, the system has enough data to start building behavioral models. If you have a dedicated casino host who contacts you proactively rather than you having to request assistance, you're definitely categorized as a regular worth retaining. If you receive personalized offers that reference your specific game preferences or playing patterns, the system has moved beyond generic promotions into targeted retention tactics. And if you find yourself structuring your schedule around casino visits, thinking about your tier status between visits, or feeling genuine emotional attachment to specific machines or properties, you've developed exactly the psychological relationship these systems are designed to create and exploit. The collective statement from the 8 former employees who've contributed testimony to this investigation centers on why they've chosen to speak publicly despite legal threats and professional consequences. They describe watching an industry that's systematically built infrastructure to identify vulnerable regular players and exploit their loyalty through increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation. These aren't 8 disgruntled former workers with axes to grind. These are people who spent years, in some cases decades, building careers in casino operations, game development, and player marketing. They left those careers because they couldn't reconcile their participation in systems they came to understand as predatory rather than entertainment focused. Their testimony isn't anti gambling broadly. Several of them explicitly state they have no moral opposition to gambling as entertainment when people understand the mathematics and maintain control over their participation. What they're speaking out against is the systematic targeting of regular players who've developed the exact psychological vulnerabilities these systems are designed to exploit. More employees are coming forward. By subscribing, you'll hear their stories as they continue to reveal the specific tactics and systems that most people never see, because they're embedded in the infrastructure itself rather than visible on the casino floor. If you're a regular player, tell me in the comments whether you've experienced any of these patterns, whether you recognized yourself in any of these stories, whether the tracking and personalization and tier anxiety have been part of your experience. Casino management doesn't want this information reaching the regular players who represent their core revenue base. Share this with anyone you know who plays regularly, anyone who's developed patterns and loyalty that make them vulnerable to these systems. And if you want to know the specific questions former employees say you should ask a casino host to protect yourself, the specific red flags that indicate you're being actively managed as a retention target rather than served as an entertainment customer. Let me know in the comments, and that investigation becomes the next priority. Stay informed, stay aware, and remember that the house always has a mathematical edge, but you don't have to make it easier for them by becoming the regular player whose data feeds the systems designed to keep you playing longer than you ever intended.